Okay, thank you all very much for joining us today. My name is Henry. I'm the Education Manager of Benjamin Franklin House, and today we're joined by Professor Mary Bilder, who teaches in the areas of property, trusts, and estates, and American legal and constitutional history at Boston College Law School. Her recent work has focused on the history of the Constitution, James Madison and the Founding Fathers, the history of judicial review, and colonial and founding era constitutionalism. Professor Bilder is a member of the American Law Institute, the Colonial Society of Massachusetts, the Massachusetts Historical Society, and a fellow of the American Bar Foundation and American Antiquarian Society. She's very kindly joined us here today to talk about her latest book, Female Genius, Eliza Harriot and George Washington at the Dawn of the Constitution, which was released in early March this year. It's a fascinating book based on the remarkable life and constitutional influence of Elizabeth Harriot Barons O'Connor, a female lecturer and educator in Philadelphia during the summer of 1787. And with that, Mary, I'm going to hand over to you and very quickly unpin myself. Thank you very much for joining us.
It's so nice of you all to have me, and I'm going to apologize because when I was a little girl at a very impressionable age of first grade, we lived in England. And so even listening this long, I can hear that very old accent beginning to reappear in how my cadence is. And so everyone's going to have to, it's not that I'm trying to fake it. It's just that when you've lived there as a first grader, trying to fit in, it makes a very indelible impression on you. So I'm just delighted to be here on the other side of the Atlantic today. And I put together a little PowerPoint presentation about some of the images in my book. And for this audience, I figured I could add back in some of the British pictures, particularly she was British, and Americans, when I talk about it on my side of the Atlantic, just want me to get to the George Washington part. And so this, I hope you'll indulge me with a little bit. I loved finding out about her British background, and I thought I'd share a little bit more of that today. So give me a second while I get myself oriented here. So hopefully that's working. Henry, you're going to let me know if that's not working for you.
Yep, that's all good.
Okay, so this is the cover of my book, and it's not Eliza Harriot. She probably was painted. She came from the class in England that would have been probably imaged, probably a miniature painted of her, but I couldn't find one for the book. And if one exists, it's probably as an anonymous lady. And so the image of the book is actually a Civil War image from the Library of Congress, but a lovely image nonetheless. And the words you see on the screen here are the epigraph of the book. The exertions of a female should be considered as presenting an example to be imitated and improved on by future candidates for literary fame. And this is what Eliza Harriot actually published in the newspaper in an advertisement she wrote for her school in the summer of 1787 repeatedly. And I love this language and idea that she has, because in some ways this is really the story of the influence of her life. She believed that a woman, what she's going to do, speak in public and try and found a very ambitious academy, wasn't the epitome of what women could do, but it provided an important example that would allow other people, particularly other women, to imitate it and then improve on it, and then hopefully become famous enough that they would be written about, as was the tradition of great individuals. So let me begin by, I thought I could begin by connecting it to Ben Franklin's house. And this is why giving this talk here is so special for me. There's a very significant Franklin connection to Eliza Harriot. Now I'm going to call her Eliza Harriot. That's her first and middle name. It's the two parts of her name that she controlled herself. And you can see on this letter, that's how she came to sign herself, always as Eliza Harriot. And there are only 5 letters of hers that exist. In fact, we only know about her from newspapers and from letters. 4 of those letters are to George Washington, but one of them, a key letter that you see here on the screen, was to Benjamin Franklin's daughter, Sally Franklin Bache. And this is a letter from the summer of 1787, where Eliza Harriot explains that Sally Franklin Bache has attended her lectures at the university, and she hopes that she will support her efforts at creating this French and English Academy for women in Philadelphia. And people who know about Sally Franklin would know that she was a great patron, and she was very, very interested in education, particularly the kind of education that was becoming very current in England and France in this period of time. And she actually tried to support the Chevalier Quesnay's effort to create a French academy in Richmond. So we have a real connection here to the Franklin family. But that's not where I came to meet Eliza Harriot. I came to meet Eliza Harriot when I was working on my previous book, which was about James Madison's notes of the Constitutional Convention. And for that project, I read every extant diary or notes from the summer of 1787. And my favorite set of notes are actually a diary kept by George Washington. He was the president of the convention, and he kept a diary, which was a practice that he had for his entire life. And on May 18th of that diary, he records this entry: "The representation from New York appeared on the floor today." And there he's referring to the delegates coming for the new Constitutional Convention. "Dined at Grace Ferry, drank tea at Mr. Morris's, after which accompanied Mrs. Morris and some other ladies to hear a Mrs. O'Connell read, a charity affair. The lady, being reduced in circumstances, had had recourse to this expedient to obtain a little money. Her performance was tolerable at the college hall." And we think about that word tolerable, which has a slightly different 18th century meaning than ours, a sort of slightly more positive meaning than we might think today. And we might remember that that's the key word, of course, in Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. And Pride and Prejudice was begun just about 10 years after this quotation by Jane Austen in her first draft. And we might remember that Mr. Darcy, the first time he meets Eliza Bennet, says, "She is tolerable, but not handsome enough to tempt me." And so there's that nice connection with this sort of key concept about how we judge women. Well, I was very interested in who was this woman? What was she doing? Was it unusual for women to speak in public? I had never heard of anybody else. And so I began to explore her life and really tried to think about what could we learn about the place of women on both sides of the Atlantic in the 1770s and 1780s from her life. And her life is really an incredible life in terms of showing us a side of women and ideas around constitutional politics that we don't always remember. So let me talk a little bit about who Elizabeth Harriot Barons was. That was how she was born, Elizabeth Harriot Barons. And I'm going to show you a couple more slides about her life, but she's British. She was born in Lisbon, Portugal, and in 1776 she marries John O'Connor, who's an Irish Catholic would-be lawyer studying in London at the Inner Temple. And I have no picture of her, as I've mentioned, and unfortunately I don't have a picture of John O'Connor. I'm going to do my next book on people who are more famous, because trying to trace John O'Connors in Ireland is not at all easy. But she comes from a prominent Admiralty family, and you can see, I think, 2 of her relatives here. This is her cousin, Catherine Hardy, later the wife of the Marquis of Annesley, and a lovely portrait painted by Thomas Lawrence. And her uncle is Sir Charles Hardy, and there we see a very beautiful George Romney portrait. So she's really a child of the early empire, and she really reminds us of how for this sort of ambitious upper aspiring group in England, the Atlantic or the blue spaces are more important than land. Her mother is a member of the Hardy family and the daughter of the first Admiral Sir Charles Hardy. Her parents meet in Lisbon at the British factory, which was a very important outpost for the British in Portugal. And there was a terrible earthquake while her relatives are there, which destroys a significant part of Lisbon. So she's born in 1749. And her father is a man named Benjamin Barons. He's important on the American side because he becomes part of early revolutionary efforts in Boston, where he's appointed as the port collector. And throughout the 1750s and 1760s, her father travels with her uncles, Charles Hardy and Joseph Hardy, back and forth. Her two uncles will actually be governor of New York and New Jersey. And her uncle, Sir Charles Hardy, is sort of rising up. They're using that classic patronage politics of this period to sort of rise up and establish themselves in British society. And so she's part of this world of aspiring gentry. She attends important female boarding school in Chelsea, and she was there probably, interestingly, at the time that John Wilkes's daughter and Tobias Smollett's daughter were at that same boarding school. Smollett and Wilkes, of course, don't get along, but it tells us something about the importance of the school she attends. And she grows up in families on her father's on her mother's side, who, you can see from these images, are sort of moving in a fairly elite group. This is Knowlton Court, which is one of her aunt's houses. And then we see her other aunt's house in the lower right-hand corner. And she probably spent time at both of these houses. And her uncle, Sir Charles Hardy, is knighted in 1755. Well, if we flip to the other side, to the man she marries, John O'Connor, Washington calls him O'Connell. He just gives an Irish Catholic name to him, but his name was actually O'Connor. We don't know too much about him. He's a little bit hard to trace, in large part because this is the period where the penal laws are very slowly being altered in Ireland, and a sort of older group of claimed descendants of the Irish royal families are beginning to sort of reassert themselves. And O'Connor either comes from those families or he's determined to look that way. This is a period where a number of families change their names from Connor back to O'Connor or add Mac to Dermot to sort of reclaim those stories. And he probably attends college in Dublin and then travels to London to attend the Inns of Court. He remains Irish Catholic until he apparently conforms simply to basically comply with British laws around who could become a practicing attorney. And he will never practice as an attorney. He's very typical of other Irish sort of aspiring gentry who travel to London to join the Inns of Court, really with an eye to become politicians or writers. And that's really what the Inns of Court is giving them. And the two of them then are married and come of age between London and Dublin in this really remarkable moment that I call the age of the Constitution. And particularly for people on your side of the Atlantic, on our side of the Atlantic, we think like, oh, we're the only people worrying about revolution and constitution. But of course, this is a key question in the 1780s, in particular in London. And they're in London as the Society for Constitutional Information and the group of people around Wilkes are pushing for expanding representation. And what's important about that is we can see how she's part of a story where the boundaries around who participates in constitutional government are being rethought. And she seems to be hanging around with that same cohort of people. And similarly, they're in London and Dublin at a moment when it appears that people may be able to alter this sort of inferiority idea about women. And we can see that most prominently in this quotation in a translation from Rousseau that dates from this period. And Rousseau says, which would you esteem the most, a woman whom you found employed in the proper occupations of her sex in her domestic concerns, or a female genius, scribbling verses on her toilette and surrounded with pamphlets of all sorts. And we understand pamphlets in this period to be political pamphlets. And it's this idea of female genius that's so key for this moment in the 1770s and 1780s, particularly in London, but also in Dublin and Paris and parts of the larger European countries. We see all sorts of spaces where women, particularly, somewhat affluent women, begin to push into areas that had been traditionally understood of as men. And so very importantly, for example, we have Catherine Macaulay, who will write the key constitutional history in this period. We see this lovely Robert Pine depiction of her as a Roman senator, wearing the kind of sash of the Roman senator. We get women called female geniuses. Phyllis Wheatley, who's the African-American poet who comes to London in this period, is described as a female genius. We see Richard Samuel's beautiful portrait of the muses of England, all these significant women. We might remember the Duchess of Devonshire's politicking and canvassing in this period. And then I think very significantly, Eliza Harriot's in London during this moment when there are this women's debating societies. And there's a large number of female debating societies in London in this period that publish the topics that they're debating in the newspaper. And so we see, for example, one idea here on the screen: ought not the women of Great Britain to have a voice in the election of representatives and to be eligible to sit in Parliament as well as men? And so she really comes of age as a young woman in this moment where people are rethinking the constitutional boundaries around political participation and rethinking around what's the role of women. And then so very significantly for my story, they then cross the Atlantic in 1786, first going to New York and then traveling southward. Her husband, John O'Connor, will never be very successful at any of his literary endeavors, and she's probably the major breadwinner for the family. In fact, a lot of their move successively southward is probably because they were running up debts, or John O'Connor's running up debts, and they had to move to keep trying to make money. And so in this sense, they also remind us of the way in which so many people in this period are itinerant, moving around, trying to find a place where they can enjoy a stable location. Now, after running a fairly successful female academy in New York for a year, one that was so important that she actually persuaded the professors of Columbia College to examine her daughters, in the spring of 1787, her husband gets an offer to be an editor of a magazine in Philadelphia. And unlike New York, which was the capital of the United States, Philadelphia is becoming the key place to be in 1787 because it's where everyone's going to gather for this constitutional convention, for this effort to write a new constitution for the United States. And so John and Eliza travel to Philadelphia, and Eliza Harriot publishes these advertisements and gives lectures in the university. As far as I know, she's the first female to give lectures as a female in the United States at a university. And she, moreover, publishes over 150 advertisements or commentaries about her lectures those summer, many of them picked up by other newspapers. So in that sense, her coverage kind of goes viral. This idea that there's a lady lecturing in the university in this way appears across the United States. And we can see on the left the kind of lecture she was proposing to read, a course of lectures. And very importantly, this looks a lot like the kind of lectures that someone like Sir William Jones is aspiring to. This is the kinds of topics that he described. And the idea that a woman would include criticism in what she was talking about publicly is very significant. And you can see in the lower advertisement, this is a second course of lectures she offered to give, in which she emphasized the faculties of the human mind, not the female mind, not the male mind, but the human mind, suggesting a kind of reformist aspiration. Well, she gives a number of lectures that summer, and very importantly, Washington attends. And in fact, Washington's attendance she probably planned for. She seems to have delayed her lecture to make sure George Washington attended. And then she and her husband wrote copy about the fact that Washington attended, including that he thought it was a good idea that she was giving lectures, and that was also picked up by other newspapers. In May of 1787, before Washington attends, a correspondent, probably Eliza Harriot, wrote this in the newspaper, also picked up across the United States, that her lectures showed that the female character should assume the station and command the honors due to the professors of science. And while Europe hears with envy that the toilette and drawing room are deserted for the forum and the college. So she has this incredibly ambitious idea about what her lectures stand for. The first step of women moving towards the political participation and towards equal education. And in fact, in the summer of 1787, right after she gives her lectures, she publishes a plan for establishing a society of belles letters, basically a French and English academy in Philadelphia that would be focused on women. Very importantly, in a period where most academies are dominated by men and most female education is run by men in the United States, Eliza Harriot plans to have a board run half men, half women, with a woman governor governed by majority rule. And it's this very important academy with its, again, advertisements that go viral that actually probably also helps to influence a much more aspirational idea of female education. A third influence she probably has is that she may explain why the American Constitution becomes gender neutral in an 18th century sense. And so there are examples in the drafting history of the US Constitution that summer where gender is specifically referred to. Very importantly, in August, the US American Constitution is altered to include a clause describing how fugitive enslaved people will be brought back. This is the beginning of what will become the great battle of the American Civil War. And the person who made that amendment to the draft thought about women escaping so powerfully that that delegate suggested the language say he or she, emphasizing female African-American agency in escaping. But by September, all of these gendered references were turned to be completely neutral, allowing the US Constitution to refer basically just to persons, with the word he being a gender neutral pronoun. And in this sense, the US Constitution was actually curiously open to the possibility that women would be allowed to be included in the body politic. Now, Eliza Harriot's ideas don't come to fruition. In Philadelphia, she's opposed by Benjamin Rush, who writes a very influential pamphlet that summer, arguing that the type of education that she was offering might be fine for people on the other side of the Atlantic, but was not what American citizens should do. He argued that American citizens should only educate women to be agreeable companions for a sensible man, the daughter or wife of an American citizen. And we can sense the nativism, particularly the anti-Irish Catholic sentiment there. This idea will become, for American historians, the idea of Republican motherhood. But Rush argues this to get rid of Eliza Harriot and her French-British influences. Now we can understand now that Eliza Harriot is suspiciously similar to the kinds of ideas that the much more famous Mary Wollstonecraft is advancing in this period. And in fact, this connection between female education, female public speaking, and female political participation actually can be seen in Wollstonecraft's life. So in 1787, Wollstonecraft's important book is Thoughts on the Education of Daughters. In 1789, she produces an anonymous text, The Female Reader, which is designed to encourage women to read in public. And then only in 92 does she move to argue that women might deserve to have some direct share in the deliberation of government. In fact, in 1792, Wollstonecraft's work is actually positively introduced into the United States. And we see here volume 1 of the Philadelphia Ladies magazine, showing the presentation of Wollstonecraft's book to the genius of the magazine. We can actually see the influence here larger. Women and people of color actually vote in New Jersey in the 1790s into 1801. And this is a New Jersey poll list including many, many women's names. And at the school in Philadelphia that Benjamin Rush supports, a young woman gets up in 1793 and argues that basically if women are educated, they will be able to open the church, the bar, the Senate's doors, where they had been rendered incapable of the exercise. So we see this kind of expansive possibility. Well, of course, that's not what happens. Instead, both Eliza Harriot's life and the American political life with respect to this idea of women participating equally vanishes. In the United States, beginning in 1792, American state constitutions move to explicitly exclude people of color and women from participation. And in fact, every state admitted to the United States between 1802 and 1876, after the Civil War, describes participants using the word male and increasingly as white. New Jersey itself disenfranchises women and people of color in 1807. And Eliza Harriot, in the wake of the French Revolution, similarly never quite gets her feet on the ground. Her husband runs up debts, and her last advertisement appears in 1799, where she's teaching in a much small place, right? She describes herself as feeble attempts at teaching. So the story is one of a sort of backlash and re-entrenchment. But we might think back to the beginning, right, where Washington attended her lecture to hear a lady deliver a lecture on the power of eloquence. Her influence and her model likely inspired the US Constitution's gender neutrality, allowing for the 19th Amendment. Her ideas about female education may be responsible for the great flourishing of female education in the decades after her, but it will be many years before another woman gets up and speaks at a public lecture at a university. So thanks very much for watching. I'm going to stop the share, and I'm happy to answer any questions, big or small, about the project.
Thanks very much for that, Mary. I'm just going to pin myself back. And yeah, if anyone does have any questions for Mary, please put them in the Q&A box or the chat. I believe both work. And then Mary, if you're happy, I'll read some out and we'll take it from there.
Okay, yeah, and I'm happy to really answer anything. Or to just talk more about something. I never know, like what would interest people. And
well, one of the things that I wanted to ask was specifically about her arrival in New York in 1886. How was she able to essentially arrive and set up a school within such a small amount of time, to the point where she's obviously up and running within a year of arrival?
Yeah, it's such a great question. You know, this is a moment where teaching, particularly on the English side of the Atlantic, is one of the few places where sort of elitish gentry women actually stand some chance to make money. And London had a number of those schools, particularly around Chelsea. And Wollstonecraft actually will try this. She actually can't stand teaching, so she doesn't do this. But it's a great question. She seems to have put advertisements in New York, and this may be really the fact that her uncle was the governor of New York. And so she's known to people. And this is where, American audiences are never quite so interested in this. But I think a lot of her exceptional story has to do with the fact that her family were very sophisticated about patronage politics and about connections and about how you worked those connections to kind of acquire power. And so when she, before they actually arrive in 1786, she seems to place advertisements saying that a lady from England, educated at Miss Aylesworthy, will be setting up this school. And then very importantly, her advertisements also appear in French, emphasizing that there will be that school will have no religious sort of forms of discrimination. And so she seems to be explicitly reaching out to this, both to Catholics, but also to people who felt that a lot of American schools were overly, Protestant in some ways. And so, but yet, and the students of that New York school include Sir William Temple, who's the London ambassador. His daughter's at that school, and the person who's Alexander Hamilton's law partner's daughter will be at that school, and then the person whose exceptionally fancy house will become Washington's house when the American capital moves back. So she really lands fast on her feet, very sophisticated. And it's a great question.
Amazing. And just a quick follow-up based on your answer. You said the advertisements were also in French. Does that mean the teaching would have also catered for French language students?
Yeah, she's part of this moment where learning French is such a key accomplishment. She was clearly fluent in French. Her husband was fluent in French. Her husband actually translates a group of French pamphlets designed to show, it's hard for us to get our mind around this with the French Revolution, but that the sort of French monarchy in the 1780s had moved to a position of sort of being like an idea of a reformist type of government, which is hard, like you're like, what? But yes. So so he translates that, and she offers French, and very importantly, she offers French speaking at her school. So in that sense, she's very modern and typical of a lot of other sort of elite female schools. And this also reminds us, for women, that's so important because so many interesting women were writing in French, particularly Madame de Genlis, who's the educator for the French royal family. And she'll actually, Eliza Harriot will read some of her plays in her lectures.
Amazing. Thank you very much. We have one question in the chat so far, and I'm just going to read it out if that's okay. And the question says, Professor Bilder mentioned this project came out of research for her previous book. I wonder if anything came up during this research that might inform future projects. I'm not sure we've explicitly mentioned what you're currently working on, but I suppose now's an excellent segue into that if you're...
Yeah. No, I fell kind of in love. As much as I've written some other stuff coming out of this project, on the American side, I wrote a piece about, this is sort of a like, who else is in Philadelphia who influences the American Constitution. Americans tend to tell that story just by looking at the white men in the room. And since we have a written constitution, that's kind of problematic. And so I've been worked on some projects trying to think about who else is there. And I wrote a piece on 4 Native Nation representatives who actually come to Philadelphia and meet with Washington. But the piece I'm now working on is I really fell in love with Catherine Macaulay and the crowd of people, Capel Loft, and this whole crowd in the 1770s and 1780s who who imagine that that people have the right to be better represented in government, and are thinking of ways to reform the Constitution in along those lines. And so I've gone back to read a lot more about that group of people, which is a little bit tricky for an American who left as a first grader, because you know, elections don't quite work the way they work the way that sometimes in America we pretend they work, with everyone being bought and sold and everything like that of their votes. But getting used to the style of electioning in England takes a little bit for even an American historian. That's a great question.
So yeah, so talking about that period, I guess it's a shame to hear about how things were different as soon as 1799, was it? That you see people.
Yeah, in the United States in the 1790s, it's actually you know, it's the same thing you can see, I think, on the British side, that the French Revolution, you know, in 1789, 1790, 1791, 1792, right? The French Revolution is looking like, for particularly for reformists, like a great moment of a country finally beginning to get moved to a more representative system. And so Catherine Macaulay and Wollstonecraft and others will write against Edmund Burke's very famous thoughts on the reflections on the French Revolution, sort of arguing for the French Revolution. Burke, of course, will be arguing against it. And then after 92, as the French Revolution enters the terror, right, the terrible bloodiness, you know, suddenly being a reformer doesn't work so well. And the power of the fear created by the sort of bloody aspects of the French Revolution really sort of force democracy, certainly on the American side of the Atlantic, and I think also on the British side, into a little bit of retrenchment. And that's added to on the American side, because this is the period when Haiti has a revolution around allowing African-American Black individuals to be freed. And a lot of the white slave owners flee to the South in that period. And so for Americans who at this time, particularly in Virginia and the Southern colonies, have built up large masses of ownership of enslaved people, expanding representation also sounds suspiciously like encouraging the idea of ending slavery and that kind of violence. And so the sort of violence of France and the violence in Haiti really create an enormous retrenchment on the American side. And I don't know enough about the history on your side of the Atlantic to know, but I have a suspicion it's somewhat similar on your side.
Yeah, definitely. Do you have an idea, or do you think you can pop a pin at the point at which things maybe return to those levels that we see in the 1780s of more, I suppose, inclusivity, I guess, less
Yeah, well, it's such an interesting question, because it really goes to the way in which the American shift towards a written constitution puts the United States on a kind of different trajectory than the British. And so because Americans in 1787 begin to develop this new genre of a written constitution, right? How are we gonna ensure that we have the kinds of constitutional protections that we had being part of England? Well, they say, well, we'll write things down. But then very quickly, people begin to understand that the advantage of writing things down is that you can exclude people in a very powerful way, right? It becomes an exceptionally powerful way to create power. And so the history in the 19th century in the United States is that white men get rid of property requirements, landed property requirements. And so white male voting expands very dramatically in the early 19th century, but explicitly at the cost of anybody else voting. And so they expand white male voting through new constitutions, but they then make sure that they exclude people of color and women from voting. And it will take the American Civil War and the amendments after that, and then really the 19th Amendment on the American side to accomplish that. Now, I think in England, right, you get a similar narrative, but done through British politics instead, which is got the same, I suppose, story of power exclusion and not, but you don't have the trickiness of the written constitutions.
Yeah, and obviously with the stories we're seeing today about the Constitution, do you feel like it's a ever growing sort of issue that you're seeing on the American side of things about the power of that written Constitution and maybe the sort of downside of that aspect to it? Is it sort of still unearthing new interest for you, perhaps, about where you could focus?
Yeah, no, it's one of my favorite topics is the difference between the American style of constitutionalism and the British style of constitutionalism. Americans really can't even imagine how you can claim to have a constitution in the British sense anymore, although arguably we do have a constitution as a system of government, but Americans are like, what? Like they don't have a constitution. And watching the two systems struggle with their different understandings of Constitution in the United States. Obviously, we have a conservative majority on our Supreme Court that has moved to a type of interpretation that really, in my opinion, sort of fetishizes the historical writtenness by going back to the founding and claiming we should have, what everybody meant was for us to be permanently in a type of government as of 1791, which I'm like, I don't think I agreed with that. But so we have, a very narrow interpretation now going on in the United States. And if you followed the politics of the United States in the last couple months around recent Supreme Court decisions, you really see that style of politics playing itself out. And of course, in other ways, right, the two histories of the United States and England are curiously similar, right? We both have had similar kinds of popular politics, emphasizing particularly the power of certain groups in society, particularly in the United States, certainly less educated white male power. We've seen a sort of resurgence around that. And so there's a way in which there's both a fundamental difference in the two systems and yet, curious similarities. And I was, my grandfather's family came from Yorkshire, and his older brothers were actually born there. And so when it was the Queen's birthday, I was like, well, the Queen, the coronation, the commemoration, I was like, well, I'm going to watch some of that. And then I was like, wait, that's so weird as an American historian to be watching something like that. But the number of Americans who, of course, are still fascinated by that aspect of the constitutional system that we've technically rebelled against is a very interesting way in which the two systems are somehow still knit together in interesting ways.
Yeah, I think we here in the UK are also quite baffled at times with the pomp and pageantry of it all, but it is certainly rather unique, but something that at the same time we share a strong history in. If anyone has any more questions, now's your opportunity to ask. Otherwise, I'm going to say thank you very much, Mary, for joining us here today. This has been recorded, and so it will be uploaded to our website so that if anyone did want to pass it on or rewatch it, then it will be on demand for all of time, hopefully. But yeah, Mary, thank you very much for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thanks so much, Henry, and I really appreciate everybody joining me before the dinner hour.
What time is it where you're based at the minute?
It's lunchtime here. So.
Well, enjoy your lunchtime. We've got a thank you very much from Richard in the chat. Says thank you for an amazing talk.
Thanks so much.
All right. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining, and thanks again to Professor Mary.